The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
All right, let's dive right into education. And this is the other side of the innovation equation, right? We've talked in terms of institutions and linking and connecting institutions, and we've talked a lot about R&D and the R&D system. But from the first class on, Romer taught us that the talent base is a very critical consideration in innovation. And how do you build up the talent base? That's essentially our set of tasks today. So first, Norm Augustine. I wanted to acquaint you with Norm Augustine because in the science and technology community he's known as Saint Augustine. And he is just an incredible stand-up figure on issues like the importance of federal R&D investment. He was chairman for a lengthy period of time of Lockheed Martin. He won the President's Medal of Technology. Just a noted innovator himself, but also a true expert on R&D issues, R&D policies, unfailingly helpful and willing to volunteer for whatever task the national academies, or in many cases MIT or other organizations, kind of need help and advice from a real senior statesman. Augustine has always been willing to step up to the plate. So he's kind of a remarkable figure. He led the Rising Against the Gathering Storm report back in like 2000, around the early 2000s timetable, along with people like Chuck Vest and a really noted community of other experts that made the argument for a very significant R&D increase for the physical science agencies. Around that time, we had been doubling NIH. This report made the case for doubling the physical science-based R&D areas as well. And it was a very influential and important report. He was one of the real leaders of it. And he played an important role, along with Chuck Vest, in helping persuade the latest Bush administration, hi Kevin, to adopt its recommendations. So there was a period of time of ongoing R&D increases for the physical science agencies. So the report had results. In addition, he came back and wrote this 2007 report that just kind of summarized, the trouble the U.S. has got on the science and technology education front. So it's a 2007 snapshot, but it's still a great little collection of key points. I'm just going to summarize it very briefly. Key finding number one was that U.S. children are not prepared for the 21st century jobs. And he has data sets, as you know, to back all these points up. Children in school are being taught by teachers that are not trained in the fields of math and science that they're teaching in, which is a major underlying problem in those students picking up those fields. U.S. children are falling behind their foreign peers and counterparts in science and technology areas. The U.S. K through 12 system just is not performing in a way that's comparable to many other systems in the world. And then kind of a fourth point is that U.S. secondary education isn't preparing students, aside from the teacher problem, for math, science, or engineering majors, and too few students, this is the key point, are majoring in those disciplines to yield the talent base that we need for technology-related careers. And just to underscore that, the U.S. ranks 17th among developed nations in the proportion of college students receiving degrees in science and engineering. And it fell from third place 30 years before. So these are dilemmas that the U.S. K through 12 system has So that's the K through 12 story. Then we shift to our friend Paul Romer, who we visited, at the outset of this class. And as you know, he taught at Stanford and then has been teaching at NYU. He's now chief economist to the World Bank, where he's been a fascinating critic of economics and changes and reforms that field needs to go through. But he came up with Prospector Theory. And in a way, what he's playing out here in this pretty noted critique from 2000, which is still quite widely read, his critique is what happened to the supply? What are our supply breakdowns? And then he's identified those supply breakdowns with higher education institutions. What are they failing to deliver? So the issue is that the federal government policies in science and technology tend to subsidize demand. So in the private sector, it's primarily tax incentives, R&D tax credits. And you promote demand to encourage science and engineering talent. That policy approach, which is astronomically expensive, those are very expensive policies. That policy approach doesn't inquire about the supply response that hopefully those subsidies elicit. And he goes back and argues that the institutional arrangements in universities, which are the key institutions on the supply side, aren't geared to meeting the needs in a variety of ways. So there needs to be a new incentive system to start to turn around the supply side because the current demand-based tax incentive system just isn't doing that. So that's his overall frame. In the 20th century, he argues rapid technological progress drove unprecedented growth. We know that argument. And that was fostered by a publicly supported system of education. So a steady flow of trained talent trained in the scientific method was a core policy that evolved over time. But that public policy approach ignored the structures that were supposed to deliver that talent base, i.e. the higher education system and the incentives and disincentives within that higher education structure that make that supply side problematic. So he would argue that a set of governmental programs to speed up innovation gets thwarted by the supply side problem, in particular by the higher education structure. So government programs focused on demand and not the supply side are going to undermine the innovation capabilities that we need. So, then he steps back and kind of makes the innovation argument for us. Or he argues that speeding up growth is really the only way we're going to be able to cope with the oncoming demographics that we talked about when we discussed the healthcare innovation system. He says that a conservative estimate of the return on R&D spending would be a 25% return. There's arguments that that's low, that it's well over 50%, but let's accept his 25%. His argument is that in theory, if you increased R&D spending by 2% of GDP, voila, we'd get a half percentage point of growth, right? In an economy that has 0.7% growth at the moment, this is not a minor concept, right? And the data would tend to, at least in theory, bear him out. But then you run into the barrier, right? You have to look at the full system, and that means also looking at the talent. So just increasing the R&D spending per se doesn't address what he calls the supply side. And if the total number of scientists and engineers is fixed, then you limit, and this is pure prospector's theory, as you remember from our first class, then you limit the biggest input into innovation and thus into growth. So by not expanding its supply of scientists and engineers, i.e. the talent base, then the U.S. is limiting its growth capacity by a pretty significant amount, he argues, in economic terms. So what's broken down? What's the heart of the problem here? And this is a deep critique of higher education, which was highly controversial when this came out and occasioned a lot of criticism of Romer. But it's hard to dispute his data, and you all probably see this from your own experiences or the experiences of colleagues in other universities. So what's broken down on the talent supply side? He argues that universities measure themselves by their ability to select top SAT scoring students. In other words, they measure themselves by the quality input they're able to attract, not by their output, right? There's no output measures in this system. They're competing with each other, and things like U.S. News and World Report on the students they attract, not on the student outcomes that they're creating. So the traditional liberal arts university, he argues, faces little pressure to respond to skills needs, right? That economic messaging that's inherent in the system doesn't get translated back to the higher education system. So meanwhile, the university has a fixed investment in its faculty that are teaching in many areas, including the sciences, but obviously outside the sciences. There is internal pressure to maintain the relative size of those departments, which they have invested in. And that in turn, and we'll discuss why in a minute, but makes it more difficult for students to get science degrees. So the science faculties, he argues, are happy to do what they call maintain professional standards, right? i.e., have a lot of lower grades, right? And effectively what that does is force out of the system a tremendous amount of talent. Because again, they've got fixed faculty sizes that aren't coordinated with what national talent supply needs may be in science and technology. There's no pressure on universities to address those corresponding faculty sizes to what the national need may or may not be, right? And therefore, what's happened is essentially a bifurcated education system where sciences and engineering students have one grading system, and as you all know, it's a tougher grading system at liberal arts universities than other majors in the social sciences and the humanities. And we know that there's significant grade inflation in the non-science, non-engineering fields, and that there's limited, if any, grade inflation in the tougher technical fields. So that's what he's talking about here, right? We maintain essentially two grading standards, the net effect of which is to substantially discourage entry of talent. Now, this is not in this report, but the National Academy of Engineering has explored extensively whether the people dropping out of majors in engineering are stronger or weaker students than those staying in. And they can't find any basis for concluding that they're any weaker, right? In other words, we're just driving talent out of the system through these mechanisms, is Romer's argument. So the supply problem by running this bifurcated grading system, right, to drive out talent, to maintain class size numbers and make sure you don't have to advise too many people. The supply problem in turn drives graduate school numbers because, of course, undergraduate degrees are prerequisites. So, how does U.S. industry cope with this? Essentially what it's done, and this is not bad, right? It's encouraged wholesale immigration from all over the world to fill the gap, right? Which it's done very systematically. And that's why, for example, industry is so concerned about this H-1B visa set of proposals that the new administration has recently proposed. What are the ramifications of that in terms of access to this talent supply? Obviously, worldwide talent, as we've talked about before, is a very important competitive advantage for the United States. But here we're in a circumstance where we're not creating parallel opportunities for folks in the U.S. Moving on with Romer's indictment of higher education, because that's really what it is, he argues that PhD programs train graduates for the academy, but as all of us in this room know, there's a complete oversupply of PhDs in terms of what the academy itself, in other words, university teaching, actually requires. So then we have to invent new mechanisms to keep this talent base around. So we invent long, endless 7 or 8 year graduate programs, right? England somehow manages to get its PhDs done in 3 years. Are they worse? I don't know. But we have a 7 or 8 year old 8 year long graduate education program. And then we invent this whole class of essentially apprentices that we call postdocs, right? Another, substantial army of people, because there's no space in the academy to accommodate these people. And yet the training system is not geared to the location where there are extensive opportunities, right? Whether in established firms or startups, which is for industry. Because the training system is really geared for, entering the academy, not for entering industry. And obviously it tends to focus more on basic than applied for obvious reasons. So this, we're just multiplying the problems here because the core input institutions, i.e. higher education, are not organized around the skills problem that society has got. So that's Romer's indictment. I had the privilege of working with him on legislation. And when this piece of legislation came out, there was considerable interest in Capitol Hill. And, we're hearing all the time on Capitol Hill in this era about, we've got a talent-based problem. And there was considerable interest in the, critiques that Romer had made of the system, and how do you change the system? So, like other senior staffers, I read his stuff and thought, gee, how are we going to turn this around? We're going to have to spend a fortune on creating a massive new kind of, kind of fellowship program across the country on top of what we already have to encourage science and engineering education. We'll have to significantly increase that, maybe by a factor of 2 or more. How are we going to afford this? Where's that money come from? So I had a conversation with Romer, and he said, Bill, you have to think like an economist here. You have to bribe the gatekeepers, right? So what are you talking about? And he said, look, figure out who the gatekeepers are in this entire system, and you bribe them, right, to make them turn around their behavior. So in this case, it's the departments and the colleges and universities as a whole. It's their administrations. Bribe them to get them to change their numbers, because if they're not producing enough scientists and engineers net, then pay them to do this. And by the way, bribery is a heck of a lot cheaper than creating a massive new national fellowship program, and much more efficient. So obviously bribery is not the apt term here, but we ended up creating a program at the National Science Foundation, which Congress passed, called the STEP Education Program, which essentially offers very significant funding to departments that guarantee they're going to turn their numbers around and then present pathways by which they're going to do so. In other words, maybe they offer much more one-on-one kind of tutorial attention to keep students in science and engineering. Maybe they offer fellowships with industry, right? So you're guaranteed summer employment in an interesting, relevant, applied field. In other words, there may be a whole slew, and there turned out to be a lot of ideas on how to begin to turn those numbers around.
Are you talking at the undergraduate level?
I'm talking at the undergraduate level.
I'm kind
Go ahead,
of
Max.
confused how you can simultaneously have a problem where you don't have enough science and engineering workers, but you also have this army of postdocs that you don't know what to do with.
Well, I mean, that's kind of the next stage of the problem. So his next piece, Max, is innovation in graduate education training, right? So in other words, create curricula that are relevant not only to training for the academy, but curricula that are also relevant to training for entry into industry. And you know, we're obviously starting to see some of these things materialize. So a school like MIT, but it's by no means alone, has a massive entrepreneurship curriculum now available to in all of its schools. This is not just a business school program. This is available across the board. And as you undergraduates know, it's really quite accessible. And there's a substantial number of business majors who do a lot of entrepreneurship, business minors who do a lot of entrepreneurship kind of features in their education. That's now much better understood by students going to universities as an option for what their route ahead might be than it was even 10 years ago. So there has been some change here, but that's another change he would make, is to make the training much more relevant to entry into established firms, into startup firms at the graduate school level. So overall, he would attempt to use some federal funding here to, in effect, redress the imbalance in federal demand and supply programs to create an input of support on the federal side, on the supply side. All right, so that's two of our three. You want to pause here because this one's so nicely controversial that we could discuss it, and you all can disagree with Romer or indicate how correct he is. Or should we do a quick pause? Who's got this one? You've got it, Max. Do you want to quickly summarize Romer? Let's do Augustine too. Great.
All right, so yeah, Augustine talks about how, well, as a lot of us know, our education in the United States isn't great before the university level. So yeah, he gives a lot of statistics, how we're doing poorly in math and science when compared to other countries, how for whatever reason, it seems that as people stay within the American system, the longer they stay in, the poorer their ability to compete with other countries is. So actually I found, one of the things, some of the, so America has in the past few decades been famous for the concept of a brain drain, where like it would take the best and brightest from other countries like India and China, they would come over here for our university system, which is nice. It's great for us. It's not great for them. But apparently this trend is slowing, as was pointed out in this article, because of some of our more isolationist policies. And I really appreciated that he mentioned it because often a lot of people try to talk about, okay, isolationism is bad because we are the world, but this, it actually gives a more concrete reason for why isolationism actually causes some significant problems to our innovation system and to our economy. So one of the questions that I wanted to pose is, how have all of our educational institutions at the university level managed to maintain their stature and their quality, despite the fact that lower level institutions like high school and below have been so, well, subpar? And can we implement some of these characteristics at these other levels? Yeah.
I think some of the answer to that comes from just the inequality across K through 12 schools. Like, the U.S. does have some fantastic schools. It's just who has access to them, and that tends to favor certain groups over others. And so instead of being able to tap into the full potential talent pool that we have, we're getting the ones who happen to live in a neighborhood that goes to a good school, or they have a nice magnet school in their county. So I think you could also pose a question like, how much better could American universities be if they had their full talent pool to choose from?
That's fair.
Yeah, I like Beth's point a lot, because there are, I mean, we definitely have institutions, higher level learning institutions, universities in the United States that are extremely famous, extremely well known, and extremely well respected. You all are at one, but if you look, I mean, that doesn't mean that every single university in the United States is internationally respected. There's this huge spectrum of the level of education or the quality of education that you can get at the university level. And I think you're exactly right. That's the same for K through 12. It's just there's a huge span. You just don't necessarily hear about the really bad university level educations.
Okay, so following up on that, then I've heard that one of the main reasons that at least for the K through 12 system, governments are unable to support the schools that are doing very well and punish the ones that are doing poorly. Is there a way that we could implement this without jeopardizing the educations of the people who are already in these systems? Because schools can't be treated exactly like a free market, because in a free market, the worst case is, okay, you buy a Zune instead of an iPhone or an iPod, and well, okay, that kind of sucks, but it doesn't suck nearly as much as it does for the kid who has to go through a year with a bad teacher. And sure, maybe the teacher gets fired after, but that's still a year that this kid has lost, and that sets them behind, and that impact can last through the rest of this person's life. So, that was a really long question, I'm sorry. So to phrase that more simply, how can we implement some sort of free market style without that inherent impact on a kid's life?
Well, I think just to reorganize the question and the assumptions you're making, why are you assuming it's the teacher's fault that in a central city school they don't do well, right? Usually it's people who really care, but the students aren't ready to learn, right? Because I forget the quote, but it's a mind is a parachute that needs to be open to receive information. So I think it's a more complex issue is the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah.
In terms of open system, I've looked into this because there's a special class called by Tom Malone, and I think we're going to be talking about the future of work next week. But he talks a lot about now we're in a distributed kind of network system, and we kind of get through hierarchy systems. And so in that class, we posited YouTube has all the videos and it's created by a ton of people. We talked about what if something made a YouTube for education where the best teachers would get the most views, and then you can quantify that and pay them really high salaries, right? So they get NBA and NBA player salaries for doing really great content, and a lot of people would access it, and pretty much the whole population would be taught by the best teachers in the country or the world, and then you'd have the personal touch Khan Academy where it's online for some subjects or learning in a really good way, and then in the actual class system you are going through the kind of the issues and figuring out what your errors are so you can learn better. So I think that's an interesting incentive. The thing though is I think this is more of the dynamics of the market, the gatekeepers problem, than it is an education problem or even the pipeline issues. If our incentive system is to get the best people to the school and not care what happens after, right? That's kind of a screwed up system, right? It's if your goal, we're not focusing on making the best students in the world. We're focusing on finding the smartest people up to that point that they become students in our university, and our reputation is based on getting the smartest people up to here. So it doesn't matter if you have a screwed up economy, there's always going to be a really top 1%. It doesn't matter, because most of the people at the school will come from all different kinds of backgrounds, and they will never say most likely it was because of their school. If they come from a poor background, they're going to say, I just went online or went to the library or learned from the best people in their books. That wasn't even a response. It was just
Well, you introduced the online idea, and we're going to jump on that, kind of at the end of the class today, right? So we should come back to that, Martine.
Which I definitely think is an interesting idea, because it's easy for anyone to access. All you need is an internet connection, and basically everyone has a cell phone.
Yeah, we'll get to this later.
And there are pros and cons on this.
It's also overdone, right? There's a ton of businesses and a ton of organizations I've seen try to do it.
Yeah.
And why haven't they figured it out? And it's probably a policy, incentives, power issue.
What's up?
Oh, you go first. Okay. Yeah, so I think just thinking about it from also an international perspective, I think a problem in the US is also the whole respect thing for teachers. Like I think especially at like the middle school or the high school, like public education system, maybe there's not as much respect for being a teacher, whereas like maybe in Sweden or like China, like being a professor or a teacher is like really well respected and like considered a really prestigious job. So I think that's like some systemic issue that's also kind of preventing maybe the top talent from going into teaching, not necessarily at the higher education level. I think there's like a lot of really intelligent academics in that space, but like definitely towards the beginning where children are like really starting out their educational careers, and that's like the fundamental. And also from what I know, like in Europe, they start kind of specializing pretty early on in like high school into what kind of track they want to pursue later on. So I feel like that could be an interesting way that they're kind of promoting, for example, engineering or math or STEM related technical expertise. Like they're really fostering that from an early stage. So that really helps and sets up the students to advance later on. Whereas like a lot of students here, they get like kind of basic introduction to everything, but then once they get to engineering classes, some people aren't very prepared.
Actually, regarding the first part of what you had said about the teachers and trying to incentivize the best talent in our country to become a teacher, that was actually my second question. I was going to ask, well, how could we incentivize them outside of pay? Because I've heard that the U.S. education system is at an all-time high for paying for the amount of money that we spend per student in a classroom. So clearly, just throwing money at this problem is not enough. So what can we do? Is there a way we can either change the culture or some other aspect?
Yeah, I think one of the problems with the U.S. system is that it's kind of punitive. Where there's like mass firing things, whereas teachers that are not like performing up to grade just being like let go, and that's kind of bad on the students because there's a lot of turnover. But I think we can maybe borrow from another model. When other cities, I think what comes to mind is Shanghai has this program where a lot of teachers or professors that are not performing as well are partnered with an educator that has more experience or has better understanding of how to reach the students, and they have this kind of like collaborative model where they bring up the teachers instead of trying to like just fire them or like dock their pay or something, which I think is probably something that would be ultimately better for like the students in general as well.
So Max, why don't we move on now to Romer?
Oh yeah, sure.
Unless anybody's got any closing points here on.
I don't know. I just want to like bring up the point that was made in one of the papers. I forget if it's this one about like access to looking at like seeing engineers. Yeah. Like if you're in a community where you never got to interact with an engineer or somebody who does STEM, you're going to see it a certain way. Especially since when you look at the subject, it's so dry in the classroom versus what you actually end up doing. I think that's also a big component, especially once you structure who you want to become, right? Because at that age you're trying to figure out who you want to be your role model. Yeah, and like an example, like Steve Jobs got to work when he was 12 at like HP, and he said that was like the thing that led him to work on tech, because like his whole background, like his dad was a mechanic. It also made him realize what a good company was because he saw how the employees were treated, and it made him see, oh, this is why having the right company culture matters. But that's a lesson he learned at 12, and it led him to like change how he saw his life.
I think on my end, in terms of Augustine, there was a point that he made about American exceptionalism and our focus on finding spectacular talent, not just on good talent. And so I remember a few weeks ago I mentioned the quote where the good becomes the enemy of the great, and maybe in the education system, the great is the enemy of the good. And perhaps we're sort of not doing a good enough job of supporting people who do a fine job at pursuing engineering and science, because we're focused on finding, the innovators, the Edisons, the Jobs, the Gates of the world. So to create a support infrastructure of people who might do a fine job at carrying out their functions, I think is ultimately the task of the education system at the lower level, and then at the university level of cultivating that talent to, really create spectacular innovation.
Yeah, like to add on to that point, I think, they definitely for the Edisons, but I think that was more in the paper where they talk about breakthrough ideas. I think this paper was more about, we have a pipeline issue that we need these kinds of employees so that these fields stay in the U.S. And they weren't looking for Edisons; they're looking for niche, like knows one discipline and can advance in that job.
So let's shift over to Romer.
Sure. You're just like, oh,
well, we're leading into it, so you might as well.
I mean, we're just like,
that's your pipeline point,
Yeah.
Martin.
Yeah, so regarding the pipeline, Romer decided to focus mostly on the undergraduate and graduate institutions and trying to figure out how you can increase the supply of the talented scientists and engineers that exist in the American innovation system. So one of the questions that I saw was posed pretty interesting. Someone was asking what metrics or measures could you use to actually evaluate these new scientists and engineers as they're coming into these fields, and how can you train them to to be prepared to go into either industry or academia?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the like professional engineer exams
Yeah.
that exist already. That's kind of like the standard.
But those aren't required, are they?
No, not usually. Well, some companies will require you to get them. It's generally just like
It's like a nice little
like thing you can check.
yeah.
That like I don't think is very like before I came to MIT I'd never even heard of it, so I don't know if that's something that carries a ton of weight. But I don't know. I don't really like the idea of using standardized tests as like a measure of competency, but I mean if you're trying to talk about a large group of people, there's no like feasible way to do it other than that. Like if you want to talk about like all the engineers that are entering the workforce, like unfortunately
really
numbers are kind of like the only way to like,
you can't
express
do
that.
like recommendation letters.
Yeah.
It's like everyone can find someone that likes them. So yes.
Might there be a reason why such extensive licensing exams exist in the medical field and not in the engineering or life sciences fields?
I mean, it's because it's probably easy to mess up, and it costs a lot of money if you mess up, so you don't want people to mess up.
But it's pretty easy to mess up in engineering.
Yeah.
Yeah, but people don't die, and you don't get like
You're not
huge
dealing with people's
lawsuits.
lives.
Well,
you
the bridge does fall down.
Yeah,
We
it's
like
like,
that.
screw off and people die.
But yeah.
I mean, to the professional engineering exams extent, to what extent does accreditation of universities already attempt to fill that role? That, you know, if you're accepted into and graduate from an accredited engineering program, you already have that check mark that like, okay.
Yeah, so like the PE exam is basically just a feather in your cap. It doesn't really,
Yeah.
or a I don't know, a little stamp on your resume. Doesn't really.
But like, is there a fault with the way that we give that accreditation to things right now? That is it becoming more meaningless if we're graduating maybe an engineer from one school that is far more capable than from another school that has the same like stamp? That
I mean, you can make the same argument with like any profession, right? Like to go with the Stephanie's example of medicine, right? So if you have someone who comes from Harvard versus, I don't know, name somewhere you don't like, Harvard. Yeah, then you can see a difference in quality.
Let me raise a question, Max. It's harder for you folks in MIT to see this because, you know, it's obviously predominantly science and engineering. But let me ask S&M and Steph, how much do you see the grade inflation at a classic, you know, high quality liberal arts school between social science, humanities kinds of majors and science and engineering majors?
I can help.
And Lily, you came from one of those institutions. Please join in. Is this real? Is the problem that Romer is seeing here, is this a real issue?
I will field to you, econ major at Wellesley College.
Not at Wellesley. There's a definite sense of grade deflation there.
It is not a sense, it is a policy.
Yes, it's a
that is
policy. It's an actual
institutionally-
policy instituted grade deflation. But in terms of the disparity between the humanities, social sciences, and the STEM fields, I think there's definitely generally there's an idea that like the STEM fields are difficult. So recently we had this policy where the first semester of your college you're shadow graded, so you're not actually given grades, and that kind of resulted in a lot of people entering the STEM fields immediately, and that was something that obviously the humanities professors and social sciences were very against, because if the students coming in were automatically going to like anything outside of their department, they kind of ended up staying there because the faculty aren't great, so they would continue in that program. So that was kind of an imbalance that occurred, and like the reason is went out onto that.
So in a way, exactly what Romer's talking about. So, interesting. Lily, what was your point?
Oh, I was a science major and I made A's in every single class I took outside of my own major. And not A's in the ones inside my major.
What were you thinking, Lily?
We started, God, I wanted to do science. We started out with almost 600 students in like the first semester chemistry course, and by the second semester chemistry, so this is chemistry majors, biology majors, and engineering majors all take that. They also have to take the second semester of chemistry, and there were probably less than 400 by the second semester. So it was a huge weed out class.
How many were at the beginning?
Over 600. Like just over 6.
Right, and most schools have notorious weed out classes that essentially frustrate the ambitions of a lot of students, particularly in the pre-med area, are obviously notorious in the, shall we say, organic chemistry is the typical weed out course. So this is a dilemma when you've got a societal need and you've got the institutions that are supposed to deliver your talent base just operating off a completely different set of incentives than what the society may be. That's the core of Romer's argument here. And another part of his argument is the numbers are not that far off. In other words, if we just got the people who wanted to major in science and engineering and mathematics to stay in the field, lots of the numbers problems get a heck of a lot better. But that 40% or more dropout rate out of those fields that typically occurs at the undergraduate level is highly problematic.
Yes.
I think they've been waiting longer if you want to.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't see your hands.
So I started to wonder about a couple of these choke points, like where actually people are starting to drop out of these science and engineering fields. I know we identified like kind of these weed out classes, and I think kind of looking from like who declares, like who ends up finishing. I think you could probably, as a whole, identify kind of grade deflation in a couple of these classes as like very complicated kind of weed out classes as like reasons why people start to kind of leave the field and migrate out. And I think it might be like indicative to sort of each institution kind of where these dropout points are. But I think en masse you can kind of take these like first year classes as kind of places where students start to fall off. And then like, is it part of kind of this college exploratory process, like kind of figuring out what you want to do? It's like how we phrase it. As like you started as a chemistry major, but maybe you end up gravitating towards social science because you don't really like the way that weed out class is structured? Or is it, part of this indicative problem that we have where like we can't graduate and sustain the people who are actually interested in these fields? And so like, I wonder if like, just because, we're not graduating enough, is it because these classes are actually structured in a way that like prevents people from graduating? Or is it like part of this kind of the way that we brand your college experience is like you're supposed to be able to explore and kind of transition in and out, especially in that, first year and experience things. And my second point was like, there's a little bit of a difference, I would say, in kind of STEM fields, even in that first year, because I know a lot of colleges offer the opportunity to sort of use high school classes to sort of test out of those first year, maybe even those weed out classes. And then it's sort of an added bonus as well because you end up testing out these classes, so you use up less semesters to finish your degree. And so I know that can be like a big reason and an incentive for students to sort of choose other universities because they're like, oh, I'll only be in this school for 3 years if I go to maybe the state school over here rather than, staying in school for 4 years at a different university. And like, is there a way to identify sort of the relative quality of education in kind of testing out of that first year of engineering classes and then finishing in 3 versus going for 4? Because I feel like if you can graduate a whole bunch of people maybe in that 3-year time span without like a marginal decrease in quality of education, we can start looking more to those programs as well.
Max, how about a closeout point on Romer?
So evidently Romer is evidence that the education problem is unbelievably complicated. Throwing money at the issue has not been sufficient to actually solve it. And there are issues with the quality, as was being talked about, the weed out courses that exist, grade inflation and deflation, standardizing. So such an issue it's going to take a very long time to solve. But all of the issues that he has pointed out, they're definitely solvable. I'd say the main barrier between us and now and a future where these issues are solved would be just politics, just trying to get people to agree to these different programs that would focus more on the education and less on the incentives of those teaching.
I think part of what's interesting about Romer's argument is that he takes the theory that we've got a set of talent supply issues, and then he attempts to figure out what are the more specific barriers to that supply, and then do an institutional analysis of why these barriers are in effect created at the higher education system. And then interestingly, he attempts to take 3 or 4 public policy fixes that could actually address these. And I do think that both his article and the STEP program the National Science Foundation created based on the legislation that he recommended that Congress passed and that NSF implemented. It was never implemented with the funding scale that was really needed to make a significant difference, but it started to send a different set of signals about supply of science and technology talent to the university system, and did, I think, have an effect over time. But these issues are obviously still with us. So let me move quickly from Romer to our next reading with Richard Freeman, and he kind of takes us to the next level of the supply problem. Richard Freeman is a quite famous labor economist at the school up the street, and he's famous for his wide range and variety of hats. As you can see, has a wonderful collection. So he looks at a different problem. Does globalization threaten and its movement in science and engineering threaten U.S. economic leadership? And I'll kind of summarize his 4 key points here. The underlying issue is that changes in the global job market for science and engineering workers, S&E workers, are eroding U.S. dominance in science and engineering, which in turn diminishes a strong comparative advantage that the U.S. historically held since the end of World War II, as we've been talking about in the past. And he makes 4 underlying points in kind of looking at this dimension. In other words, we have Augustine's critique of K through 12. We have Romer's critique of the higher education system. And then Richard Freeman kind of tells us what the economic implications are of failing to maintain that leadership base in science and engineering talent. So his point is that the share of the world's science and engineering graduates in the U.S. is in decline. And look, others are understanding this model and moving to fill it. Second, that the job market has worsened for younger workers in science and engineering fields relative to many other high-level occupations, which in turn discourages U.S. students from entering those fields. Now, he's writing this at the time when a startling proportion of MIT students and other science and engineering graduates in other schools were going into the financial sector, financial services, and consulting. Some of that, since he wrote, is turned around. In other words, there has been an emergence at MIT of interest in startups and entrepreneurship to the tune that some 20 to 25% of those of you, when you graduate, your graduating classmates will go into those fields. In a way, that community moved out of financial services post-2008 crash and moved over to what may be a really important kind of career shift in terms of the country's future. But that hadn't occurred yet by the time he's writing this. So, in other words, the extremely high pay available to those entering financial services and consulting drained talent out of the system, is his point, within the U.S. And then, countries like China and India found that they could compete with the US in high tech by starting to train substantial numbers of science and engineering specialists. In other words, they could leapfrog, right, and in effect go to substantial portions of their economy being quite high tech, even while they were working on bringing up what's in effect a developing world economy in the meantime, right? So they hit on this model, and it's a really important model, but that in turn had an effect on kind of US dominance in this field. I mean, this is not necessarily a bad thing for the world to get better, but it doesn't have an effect on a US comparative advantage. So to ease the adjustment to a less dominant position in science and engineering with the corresponding economic ramifications for US economic growth and well-being and competitiveness, the US is going to have to develop, he argues, new labor market and R&D policies that start to kind of change the science and engineering talent numbers. So we're going to have to step into the marketplace. And, and this is where Romer's thinking would come to bear. So let me move to Golden and Katz, and they further talk about the societal ramifications for what we're doing in higher education, right? And we've talked a bit about this before, and they also teach up the street, and their book, The Race Between Education and Technology, has a quite important one. I think has held up well since it came out in 2009. But I had you read a short version, a Millikan Institute review piece that came out before they put their book out. But I do recommend the book to you. The gap between wages of educated and less well-educated workers has been growing since 1980. And this expanding wage inequality has characterized the US since that time. So we're becoming a much more polarized society, and the lines are drawn on education lines, right? And we've talked about this before, but this is David Otter's barbell problem, right? That our society is increasingly looking like a barbell, and we've got on one bell a growing and successful upper middle class that has the education and is able to use that education to capture the wealth, a thinning middle and a growing lower end services economy that's less well paid and less well off, to which substantial portions of the middle are now being shunted. And we can start to see this polarization in our economy in pretty sharp terms. And that's what Katz and Golden are writing about. The wage inequality narrowed in the United States significantly from about 1910 through the 1950s. Then it stabilized until about the 1980s, right? And then it's grown since that time. Why? And they argue, well, I'll attempt to just paint you a quick picture, but they argue that there is a race between education and technology. And that what happened in the US was that there is an ever-growing curve of technology knowledge since the Industrial Revolution. And we've talked about this previously, but I'll reiterate it, that an economy requires. In other words, it requires an ever-growing level of technological sophistication, right? And the genius of the US system was to create mass higher education, which we did first through the Land-Grant Act, and of course that created MIT. That was the big enabler for MIT. It had initial funding in 1861. As graduating class marched off to the Civil War, there was no revenue base. In 1862, Congress passed the Land-Grant College Act, and suddenly there was a revenue stream to make up for the loss of talent, right? Loss of the tuition base. So that saved MIT. But created public higher education really across the country, in every state at the time, and then extended to newer ones. So we created that system of mass higher education really through the Land-Grant College Act in 1862. No other country had done anything like that. So we created a talent base that stayed ahead of the technological curve, right? And that's what you want, right? You want your talent base to stay ahead of the increased sophistication of technology in the economy so that that talent base can keep moving that curve up, right? And that they benefit each other, right? And then what Katz and Golden point out is that in the mid-70s, we leveled that off.
Was there something that caused it in particular?
You know, let me get to that in a minute, Martine, but we do need to come back to that. And I don't think we fully understand the dimensions of what was happening at that point, but there's some thoughts. So what happened was that the people that continue to ride this curve, right, they stayed up with the technology curve, right? Those that fell off fell behind the curve and their incomes correspondingly suffered. That's the case that they're making, right? And that these people got left off the curve and couldn't keep riding up to take advantage of the economic gain. So you've got a smaller number of people, you know, riding this curve up. They get the gains, right? Whereas in this period of time between 1910 and 1950, everybody, or at least a very large part of the population, was riding that curve and able to benefit. So that's the great creation of this mass middle class in the United States. And the data, you know, tends to bear this out. So that's their essential equation here on what happened. Again, they argue that technological advance is the key to growth. We know that from this class. And that the ebb and flow of wage equality and inequality is very much related to the skill set you've got to keep riding that technological curve. Now look, if anything, the growth in that technological curve has just gotten steeper, right? With the development of all these information technologies. You know, heaven forbid in the next generation if you don't have coding skills, right? With the entry of significant amount of artificial intelligence in the economy, if you're gonna stay up, you really need that skill base. Otherwise, you're gonna get left behind. So, you know, that's essentially their picture of what's been going on here. Let me, that stagnation of education levels around 73 or so coincides with the period of economic challenge from Japan that we talked about in the second manufacturing class. That's the period where the Rust Belt gets created, right? So the US had been on an ever-rising economic curve. Suddenly its growth rate fell to the 2% range, and it's from its historic 3% range, and its productivity rate, which drives growth, as we've talked about, its productivity rate fell to the 1% range. So that means there's less real wealth in the economy, and that may, Martine, in answer to your question, that may have had something to do with our ability to keep financing ever-growing education. Now remember that the public universities provide 80% of higher education, right? That's the key component of the system. You know, places like MIT are all very well and good, but that's, you know, a 20% share. The core talent base is getting trained in public universities. And other things have been happening to those public universities, right? So they're competing at the state level for funding with two major factors. One is Medicaid, which the states bear a very large portion of, and the other is prisons, right? Because we have had massive prison growth, and the annual cost of prisoners is much higher than putting people in higher education. You begin to wonder where your priorities are when you think about that. So there have been increased pressure on state budgets that correspond with that 73 to like 1990 or 1991 kind of economic decline period that may account for it. Now, the Obama administration understood this curve well. And Obama was fluent with Katz and Golden's work. And they made a major effort to increase Pell Grants and increase the availability of higher education funding. So interestingly, there was an improvement in the last decade in some of these numbers. Some of that was driven by the fact that, jobs were a disaster in 2007, 2008. So people tended to spend that time, if they could afford it, in higher education locations. So there was some of that going on. But overall, the administration made an attempt to try and get those numbers turned around, and they're a bit better. And the public universities themselves understood their mission and realized that they're going to have to increase their enrollment base in order to accomplish this. All right, so that's Katz and Golden. I mean, there's other important points there, but that's key. And then I want to do, we've talked about higher education and as though it's the only way here, but I wanted to introduce some controversy into the debate. So William Baumol, very noted economist, taught at Princeton, more recent years has been teaching at NYU, a remarkable analyst. And he was written in many different kind of economics fields. Baumol does this NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, kind of work paper that just, nails the whole system. So I thought we'd introduce a little controversy into in today's class by putting his piece in front of us. He argues that breakthrough innovation comes from independent inventors and entrepreneurs, that large firms concentrate on incremental innovation. We've talked about this a bit before. And his conclusion is what is startling. Education for the mastery of science knowledge aids incremental advance, doesn't necessarily prepare you for doing the breakthrough entrepreneurial side, right? So his point then is that kind of standard science education may actually impede breakthrough thinking, and that large firm R&D requires scientists and engineers that are educated in the established fields and the established analytical methods, and that successful innovators and entrepreneurs often lack that standard preparation, and that may get them out of the box of incremental advance into kind of new territories. And he points out that we don't have a system and we don't understand breakthrough learning. How do we educate for innovation? We have no real clue on how to do that. And that procedures for incremental learning do seem to work, but we don't know how to educate for the innovation side. Of the innovation system, who's got what? He points out that Procter & Gamble, with 7,500 scientists and 1,250 PhDs, I mean, these kinds of totals start to dwarf the size of faculties at MIT and Harvard and Stanford and so forth. With 22 research centers P&G has in 12 different nations, that's a pretty amazing talent base. What are they up to? Remember that when you look at R&D combined, industry spends about 70% of the total spending on R&D. Now, of course, we know that that's D, not R, right? But industry's got about a 70% share. The federal government, about 30% share. That's R. So that gives us an idea of the different size of the establishments in the R&D side. So we know that industry employs some 64% of scientists and engineers, right? So industry has got that talent base. And he notes that critical breakthrough historical innovator figures like Watt, Whitney, Fulton, Morse, Edison, the Wright brothers, Wozniak, Jobs, Gates, Dell have no college degrees. And frankly, limited scientific training.
Wait, Jobs had his college degree?
Yes, he had a college degree, right? No, he didn't finish Reed.
He didn't?
No, he left the first year.
Yeah, he left after a year or two.
I thought he went somewhere else.
He stayed in Reed and just dropped in on classes, but it wouldn't count as getting a degree.
He was studying things like calligraphy that actually turned out to be incredibly important for him.
I mean, that's the quote example. He went to a lot of classes though, like he's
right. And he spent a year in India. And,
yeah, he did a lot of interesting things.
So, Baumel's point is progress requires, we shouldn't underestimate this. It's not that one side is bad. Progress requires both breakthrough radical advance and incremental advance. And an example which I've used before with you all, if you're flying across the Atlantic Ocean, the Wright brothers, motorized kite is a terrific radical breakthrough advance, but I'd rather take the 787, product of 10 decades worth of incremental advances, when I go across the ocean, right? So both are really important here, right? You've got to do both pieces. But a disproportionate share of the breakthroughs do seem to come from kind of independent inventors or entrepreneurs, and large firms tend to specialize on the incremental, in part because they don't want to break up their own business models, right? They've got established business models. They want to contribute to those business models rather than wreck their existing business models. So that's part of the economic motivation here. But education for incremental advance may well be different, as Baumel points out, than education for the novel advance. And incremental improvement may well require a much greater mastery of demanding science and technology information than the novel idea. So both are essential, but then he poses a critical question, how do you educate for the original and novel idea generation? So we've got 3 new stories on the table here. And let's start off discussion of them. We'll take a break in a bit. First, we've got Richard Freeman.
Yes. I wanted to make some strides actually on a point that Baumel made in our conversation of Freeman, since Baumel is the one who cited P&G as an innovative research and development firm with a lot of PhDs. One of you posed the question about Freeman. This paper logs the relationship in the United States between firms and university research. For multinational companies, what incentives do they have to promote U.S. innovation leadership, even when they may be based in the U.S., when they operate in so many different countries? So at the heart of this question is, why do we need to invest in America? If it is that the private sector is not investing and has no rational self-interest to invest in us from an economic perspective. That is the implication of this question.
I know, the thing is, I think we look at it one-dimensionally. You should have to look at it think about an individual, right? You're going to be a baby, and there's a whole gestation period, then there's a kid, there's a time period where you're trying to grow as an individual, and there's one you're ready to get to it, right? And you kind of you're very useful. So for industry, they can't really handle this whole gestation period, 1 to 18 years old period. But they can handle it after, when you're ready to go and do little ramp-up skills. But to do a whole thing is pretty difficult. Is that an interesting answer?
I'd add, too, that the U.S. has an extremely decentralized labor market. So there is a huge disincentive for employers in the United States to offer training, because they offer training which can be, quite expensive, investing in you. That in turn equips you to move on. So often another employer will buy you out for a lower margin than what the education costs, but the employer who invested in your education won't be able to match that increment. So why should they invest in employees if the talent is going to go elsewhere? And countries like Germany have a much more established set of apprenticeship rules and much more heavily unionized, 80% unionized in the manufacturing sector. They have been able to create an apprenticeship system that's much more enduring and employer-tied, that creates a tremendous encouragement for employers to provide lots of skills training to its employees. Indeed, it's really a part of the German education system. We have never really been able, because we have such a decentralized and almost laissez-faire labor market, we've never been able to create significant incentives for employers to provide education. It's a deep structural problem in our system. And it's one we're going to probably have to figure out how to deal with. We have created a whole system of community colleges, but the burden is on the employee to go back and get that education, and we make that pretty inexpensive.
Going back to your bribe the gatekeeper thing, couldn't we just bribe them?
Bribe the employees? Yeah, the employers? Yeah.
Yeah, pay
Right,
for
we
the
could.
education. How much is it?
I'm sure it's not cheap, right?
Damn it.
But in other words, could we create an incentive for employers to provide the education system, even if they weren't able to retain their workers?
Okay.
Right? Could we? And what would that cost? Right. So maybe the feds would pick up that cost. So in a way, the community college system is a way of the government picking up that cost, shared with the employee, because employers can't take the risk of mitigating. I've kind of jumped into the discussion here, and I want to give it back to you, Steph. Get me out of this.
I think that's who posed this question. Yeah, I think it really gets at the heart of all three readings, right? And I think one in particular. Let me see if I can parse for a quote here from one of the readings. Actually, it was in Friedman's reading when he quoted Derek Bach, who is the founder. He was, president of Harvard. And now the Graduate School of Education at Harvard has a Center for Innovative Learning named after Derek Bach. And he claimed towards the end of the piece, or rather, he was cited towards the end of the piece as saying that other countries are facilitating our enterprise model. And I think it's really meritorious of consideration that if our education system is not supporting the production of scientists and engineers, and firms are, sort of ready and happy to get employees from other countries or to move to other countries, that we're effectively shooting ourselves in the foot, right, by participating in free market principles for education, because we can't provide the labor force, and we can't support the labor force, and we can't support incentives financially. So at the end of the day, we're preventing ourselves on all fronts from innovating, which I think is a really important consideration that, merits sort of being honest with ourselves as not only a society, but also as, a political economy.
Something I've throughout all the readings that I have not understood, how is it that we're spending so much on education, like so much money per student, yet teachers not getting any of it, and the students don't have very high quality educations. So where's the money going?
Yeah, Max, I think that was addressed by Norman Augustine's piece very slightly when he talked about the appropriation of funds and where spending goes. Specifically, Augustine cited that 61% of education budgets at schools tend to go to education spending sort of broadly, and that it actually tends to trend downward for a lot of school districts who focus on other extracurricular activities like sports. And I think he made that very brief note about the role of American culture in those funding priorities. And I think that also was a consideration of mine in reading this piece in conjunction with the Freeman piece, right? Like, what is the role that our own vision of ourselves and how we want to educate our children informs our policy decisions in spending down the line, right? And you brought the point earlier that how is it that we don't have, or that we have too many jobs, that we don't have enough jobs, but have too many PhDs, but then not have enough PhDs. And I think that's the point that Bill was trying to make, is that we have too many PhDs who are trying to go into academia, but not enough PhDs who are prepared for industry, and not enough PhDs generally to go into industry. Does that clear things up a little?
That clears it up a lot.
Okay.
I think I'd add an additional point there, and this is a complex one that you all are free to disagree with, but when we created the higher education system in the US, obviously it occurred over the process of centuries, and when the federal government during and following World War II came into a very significant supportive role for that system in addition to the states, that was already a quite competitive system. And as someone who has spent substantial amount of time with MIT's top administrators, I can tell you that MIT and other universities do exactly the same thing. They watch their university competitors like hawks. They know exactly what they're up to. They know exactly what they're spending on what. They know exactly what their competition models are. They're looking very hard at how MIT will compete all the time. It is an extremely competitive model. It drives a tremendous search for talent at the faculty level as well at the student level. And that talent base is very well compensated, right? And that is a core way by which you compete for talent in a competitive system. We don't really have a competitive system in the K through 12 public education system. It's essentially a monopoly-based socialist model, frankly. And part of the entry of charter school legislation was to introduce a competitive model into the K through 12 system. Now, there's a big debate as to how well that's worked, but I think fair to say, overall, it's added a significant dose of competition into that system. And you can look at competition in healthcare, and you can look at competition in, other large government-supported systems too. But, when we came out of World War II, we created a socialist model for caring for veterans in federally owned hospitals, and we fit into what was already a competitive space by supporting students who in turn were, given funding, and they could take the money with them. It didn't go to the universities to fund them. So its introduction of more competitive models here may have something to do with improvements in higher education. At least that was the concept behind introducing charter schools.
Could I ask you a follow-up? I know that other countries have normal schools, which are schools meant to train.
Yeah, other countries have socialist models and make them work, right? We're just not as good at that.
What prevented the United States from developing normal schools or incorporating normal schools into their model?
I don't want to claim to be an expert on the creation of normal schools, but in the 19th century, the U.S. did create both the institutions for mass higher education, i.e. the public universities, and high school education in a very short period of time. And communities were essentially realizing that they had to upgrade the skills for an industrial economy as their population shifted from farming to working in manufacturing firms primarily. And they understood the need for upgraded skill sets, and there was an effort across the country to create high schools. Now, some regions, particularly New England, had them, but the rest of the country, including the American South, is pretty quick to replicate a high school model as a fix for a needed skill set. So it was, that is a massive social policy that was done in a remarkably, short period of decades across the country. So the country is capable of making really major changes. I don't think I answered your question though, but.
Okay. I certainly think it's important to consider as it was highlighted, I think, in several of the readings, the role of teachers, one, moving forward in the future, two, how teachers are currently being educated, three, how teachers are being compensated and sustained within the model. They seem to be sort of an undercurrent of what we're talking about, but not something that any of the readings are willing to address specifically, and perhaps strategically for political reasons.